The United States just indicted a former communist leader for killing Americans nearly 30 years ago. Not a cartel boss, not a terrorist commander, a former head of state. Former Cuban President Raúl Castro now faces U.S. charges connected to the 1996 downing of 2 civilian aircraft. 4 Cuban exiles died in the attack, and Washington says the order came from the very top of Cuba's leadership. The Justice Department accused Castro and 5 former Cuban pilots of conspiracy, murder, and destruction of aircraft. The announcement exploded across Miami immediately. Crowds cheered outside Freedom Tower, the symbolic heart of the Cuban exile community. The timing matters enormously. Cuba currently faces devastating blackouts, fuel shortages, and economic collapse. The Trump administration has sharply increased pressure on Havana. And Venezuela, Cuba's closest ally, recently fell into chaos. So many analysts now ask a bigger question. Is this indictment really about justice alone? Or is Washington sending a warning to Cuba's government during one of its weakest moments in decades? Because this case touches everything: Cold War history, Florida politics, Latin American power struggles, and America's modern strategy against hostile governments. To understand this story, you need to go back to February 24th, 1996. A Cuban exile group called Brothers to the Rescue operated small civilian aircraft near Cuba regularly. The group originally searched for Cubans escaping the island on homemade rafts. But it also openly opposed Cuba's communist government. Cuban authorities accused the group of violating Cuban airspace repeatedly. Then, disaster struck. 2 Cuban MiG fighter jets shot down 2 Brothers to the Rescue planes. 4 men died. 3 were American citizens. 1 was a U.S. resident. Cuba claimed the planes violated its airspace. But international investigations later concluded the aircraft were in international airspace during the attack. The incident shocked Washington immediately. The Clinton administration condemned Cuba strongly. Congress later tightened sanctions dramatically through the Helms-Burton Act. For decades afterward, Cuban exile groups demanded criminal charges against Cuban officials involved in the operation. Now, nearly 30 years later, the Justice Department finally acted. Prosecutors allege the order moved through Cuba's military chain of command, with Fidel and Raúl Castro as final decision-makers. And the indictment arrives during one of the worst crises Cuba has faced since the Soviet Union collapsed. Officially, the case focuses on justice for 4 dead civilians. But geopolitics clearly shapes the timing too. Cuba currently faces severe economic collapse. Rolling blackouts reportedly last more than 20 hours daily in some areas. Fuel shortages cripple transportation and electricity generation. Food scarcity worsens continuously. Meanwhile, the Trump administration increased pressure aggressively this year. Washington already tightened sanctions and disrupted oil flows linked to Venezuela. That matters because Cuba depended heavily on subsidized Venezuelan oil for years. But after Venezuela's political collapse and instability, Havana lost a critical economic lifeline. Now Cuba looks increasingly vulnerable. The United States clearly recognizes that weakness. That helps explain why Washington revived one of the Cold War's most emotionally charged, unresolved cases now. The symbolism also mattered enormously. Officials announced the indictment outside Miami's Freedom Tower on Cuban Independence Day celebrations. Raúl Castro is not the first foreign leader targeted this way. The United States previously indicted Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro. Russian officials also face international warrants and legal accusations. This strategy serves several purposes simultaneously. First, it isolates leaders diplomatically. Second, it damages legitimacy internationally. Third, it increases political pressure without direct military confrontation. Even if no trial ever happens, the indictment still matters politically. And realistically, Cuba will never extradite Raúl Castro voluntarily. Despite stepping down officially years ago, Castro still holds enormous symbolic influence inside Cuba's military and Communist Party. Washington understands this. So the real objective may not be prosecution itself. The real objective may be pressure. The indictment reframes Cuba internationally. Instead of discussing only sanctions or humanitarian problems, global headlines now focus on allegations of state violence against civilians. That damages Havana's international image further, especially at a moment when Cuba desperately needs investment and diplomatic support. But there is another powerful force shaping this case: domestic American politics. And nowhere matters more politically than Florida. For decades, Cuban American communities heavily influenced U.S. policy toward Cuba, especially in Florida. And Florida remains one of America's most politically important states. Cuban exile groups long viewed the 1996 shootdown as an act of state terrorism. Families of the victims spent decades demanding accountability. Now, influential Cuban American lawmakers celebrate the indictment openly. Representatives Mario Diaz-Balart, Carlos Jimenez, Maria Elvira Salazar, and Nicole Maliotakis strongly pushed for charges. That political pressure matters enormously, especially under a Republican administration focused heavily on Florida voters. But this issue goes deeper than elections. For many Cuban exile families, the Brothers to the Rescue incident symbolizes Havana's willingness to attack dissidents beyond Cuban territory itself. That memory remains emotionally powerful nearly 30 years later. Meanwhile, Cuba's government presents a completely different narrative. Havana accuses Washington of trying to suffocate Cuba economically and politically. Cuban officials describe sanctions and fuel restrictions as economic warfare. Many ordinary Cubans now face severe hardship daily because of shortages and infrastructure collapse. That creates a dangerous cycle. Washington increases pressure, believing the Cuban government weakens. But Havana uses external pressure to strengthen nationalist sentiment internally. And historically, that cycle has defined U.S.-Cuba relations for generations, which means this indictment could deepen confrontation instead of creating accountability. First, U.S.-Cuba relations will likely worsen further. This indictment destroys chances for diplomatic normalization anytime soon. Second, Cuba may move even closer toward China and Russia. As American pressure increases, Havana will search harder for alternative partners and economic support. Third, instability inside Cuba could intensify. Food shortages, fuel scarcity, and blackouts already strain society heavily. More pressure could increase migration toward the United States. That creates political and humanitarian challenges for Washington too. Fourth, this case signals a broader global trend. America increasingly combines legal pressure with geopolitical strategy, meaning criminal indictments now function partly as foreign policy tools. And finally, this story reminds the world of something important. The Cold War officially ended decades ago, but many of its battles still shape politics across the Americas today. Nearly 30 years after 4 civilian planes fell from the sky near Cuba, Washington reopened one of the Cold War's most painful chapters. But this indictment is not only about the past, it is also about America's future strategy toward Cuba, Latin America, and hostile governments worldwide.